In the scorching summer of 1841, I witnessed something in rural Alabama that still haunts my dreams 83 years later. As the newly appointed county clerk for Millbrook County, I thought I had seen the worst of human nature in my official duties. I was wrong. The Harrison family owned the largest cotton plantation in our district, and their grand white mansion on Cypress Hill had been the pride of our community for 3 generations. But behind those pristine columns and manicured gardens lay a secret, so horrifying that when we finally uncovered it, 38 innocent souls were discovered bound and imprisoned in conditions that defied all human decency. What we found in that attic changed everything we thought we knew about our neighbors, our community, and the very nature of evil itself. The stench that hit us when we opened that door, the sight of those hollow eyes staring back at us, and the realization that this nightmare had been happening just miles from our homes for years will forever be seared into my memory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year 1841 marked my 3rd season as county clerk in Millbrook County, Alabama, a position that had brought me into contact with every prominent family in our rural district. Our community sprawled across fertile cotton lands, where grand plantations dotted the landscape like monuments to Southern prosperity. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving, with plantation owners at the apex, followed by merchants, small farmers, and finally the enslaved population that made the entire system possible. Millbrook County contained roughly 4,000 souls, most of whom lived within a day's ride of our small county seat. The Harrison plantation, known locally as Cypress Manor, commanded respect and admiration from everyone in the district. Thomas Harrison had inherited the property from his father, along with 160 enslaved workers and nearly 3,000 acres of prime cotton land. His wife, Elizabeth Harrison, was considered the epitome of Southern grace, known throughout the county for her charitable works and elegant dinner parties. My position as county clerk required me to maintain detailed records of births, deaths, property transfers, and various legal proceedings. It was tedious work, but it afforded me unique insights into the private affairs of our community's most influential families. I prided myself on my attention to detail and my ability to maintain the confidentiality that my position demanded. The Harrison family occupied the pinnacle of our social structure. Thomas Harrison served on the county board of supervisors, while Elizabeth Harrison organized charity drives for the local Methodist church. Their 3 children, Margaret, Samuel, and young Catherine, were considered models of proper upbringing. The family's reputation was spotless, their plantation profitable, and their standing in the community unassailable. During my regular visits to Cypress Manor for official business, I had always been impressed by the immaculate condition of the property. The mansion itself was a testament to architectural grandeur, with towering white columns, expansive verandas, and meticulously maintained gardens that stretched toward the cotton fields beyond. The interior featured imported furniture, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that spoke to both wealth and refined taste. Elizabeth Harrison was particularly gracious during my visits, always offering refreshments and inquiring about my family's welfare. She had a way of making even mundane business transactions feel like social calls, and I genuinely enjoyed our conversations about literature, politics, and community affairs. Thomas Harrison, while more reserved than his wife, was invariably polite and efficient in his dealings with county matters. The enslaved population at Cypress Manor appeared well maintained compared to other plantations in the district. The quarters were substantial wooden structures, and I had observed that the workers seemed adequately fed and clothed. This attention to the welfare of his enslaved labor force was another point of pride for Thomas Harrison, who often spoke about his responsibilities as a Christian steward. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My duties required me to visit Cypress Manor approximately once every 6 weeks to update property records, process legal documents, and handle various administrative matters. These visits typically lasted 2 to 3 hours and involved extensive consultation of plantation records, slave inventories, and financial documents. The Harrison family maintained meticulous records, which made my job considerably easier than it might have been otherwise. During the winter months of early 1841, I began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere at Cypress Manor. Elizabeth Harrison, while still gracious, seemed more distracted during our conversations. She would occasionally pause mid-sentence, as if listening for something, and I noticed that she kept glancing toward the ceiling with an expression I could not quite interpret. When I asked if everything was well, she would smile and redirect our conversation to safer topics. Thomas Harrison's demeanor also shifted during this period. He became more abrupt in his business dealings, eager to conclude our meetings as quickly as possible. Where he had previously taken pride in showing me improvements to the plantation or discussing his latest agricultural innovations, he now seemed anxious to escort me directly to his study, complete our business, and see me on my way. The household staff, both enslaved and free, appeared more subdued than usual. The normally cheerful cook, a woman named Ruth, who had always greeted me warmly, now avoided eye contact and hurried through her duties with apparent nervousness. Even the Harrison children seemed different, more quiet and withdrawn than I remembered from previous visits. These changes were subtle enough that I initially attributed them to the normal stresses of plantation management or perhaps family matters that were none of my concern. However, my training as a clerk had taught me to notice patterns and discrepancies, and the accumulating evidence suggested that something significant had changed at Cypress Manor. The most puzzling development was the appearance of additional supplies being delivered to the plantation. During my February visit, I observed wagons arriving with what appeared to be unusually large quantities of basic provisions, medical supplies, and heavy chains that seemed inconsistent with normal plantation operations. When I mentioned this to Thomas Harrison, he explained that he was expanding his operations and needed additional materials for various construction projects. My suspicions were further aroused by changes in the plantation's daily routines. During previous visits, I had grown accustomed to the normal sounds of plantation life, the voices of workers in the fields, children playing near the quarters, and the general bustle of a thriving agricultural operation. But now, Cypress Manor seemed strangely muted, as if an invisible blanket had been thrown over the entire property. The most unsettling change was the appearance of new security measures around the main house. Heavy iron locks had been installed on doors that had never been secured before, and I noticed that certain areas of the mansion were now declared off-limits to visitors. Elizabeth Harrison explained that they were renovating portions of the house and did not want guests to be inconvenienced by the construction noise and debris. Despite these explanations, my instincts told me that something was fundamentally wrong at Cypress Manor. The Harrison family's behavior had become increasingly secretive, and the atmosphere of the plantation had taken on an oppressive quality that made me uncomfortable during my official visits. However, my position required discretion, and I had no legitimate reason to probe deeper into the family's private affairs. The tension reached a breaking point during my March visit when I heard what sounded like children crying from somewhere within the mansion. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from what appeared to be the upper floors of the house. When I mentioned this to Elizabeth Harrison, she quickly explained that her daughter Catherine had been suffering from nightmares and was being comforted by her nursemaid. However, the crying I heard did not sound like a single child, but rather multiple voices, and the distress in those sounds was unlike anything I had ever heard from a child experiencing normal nighttime fears. The haunting quality of those cries stayed with me long after I left Cypress Manor, and I found myself losing sleep as I wondered what could be causing such obvious anguish. My professional obligations required me to maintain objectivity and avoid jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information. However, the accumulating evidence suggested that the Harrison family was hiding something significant, something that involved children in distress and required elaborate security measures to conceal. The weight of this knowledge began to affect my ability to perform my duties with the detached professionalism that my position demanded. As spring arrived in Millbrook County, I made a decision that would forever change not only my understanding of the Harrison family, but my faith in the fundamental decency of human nature. The time had come to investigate the truth behind the changes at Cypress Manor, regardless of the personal and professional consequences that such an investigation might bring. My opportunity to investigate came sooner than expected when Thomas Harrison requested an emergency meeting regarding urgent property documents that required immediate attention. He explained that a potential buyer from Charleston was interested in purchasing a section of his cotton fields, and the transaction needed to be completed within days to meet the buyer's deadline. I arrived at Cypress Manor on a humid Tuesday morning in April, carrying my leather satchel filled with the necessary legal forms and record books. Elizabeth Harrison greeted me at the front door, but her usual warmth was replaced by an almost frantic nervousness that immediately put me on edge. Her hands trembled as she gestured for me to enter, and I noticed dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had not been sleeping well. Thomas Harrison was waiting in his study, surrounded by papers and ledgers that appeared to have been hastily assembled. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and his hair uncombed. When he shook my hand, his palm was damp with perspiration despite the cool morning air, and his grip was noticeably weaker than usual. As we began reviewing the property documents, I became increasingly aware of sounds emanating from the upper floors of the mansion. The noises were subtle at first, occasional creaking that could be attributed to the settling of an old house, but gradually they became more distinct and troubling. I heard what sounded like muffled voices, occasional thumping sounds, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be children whimpering. Thomas Harrison seemed oblivious to these sounds, speaking loudly about property boundaries and surveying details in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to mask the noises from above. Elizabeth Harrison had excused herself from our meeting, claiming she needed to supervise the preparation of lunch, but I suspected her real purpose was to address whatever was happening upstairs. The sounds grew more pronounced as our meeting continued. I distinctly heard what sounded like children calling for help, their voices weak and desperate. The words were indistinct, but the tone of anguish was unmistakable. Thomas Harrison's voice became increasingly strained as he continued discussing the property sale, his explanations becoming more elaborate and less coherent as the sounds from above intensified. When a particularly loud crash echoed from the upper floors, followed by what sounded like multiple children crying simultaneously, I could no longer maintain the pretense of conducting normal business. I looked directly at Thomas Harrison and asked if perhaps we should check on what was happening upstairs, as it sounded like someone might be in distress. His reaction was immediate and telling. His face drained of color, and he stammered that his children were simply playing games with some visiting cousins who were staying at the plantation. He explained that children could be quite boisterous when left to their own devices, and he apologized for the disturbance. However, his explanation made no sense, as I knew the Harrison children were away at boarding school and were not expected to return until summer. I pressed him gently about the visiting cousins, asking which family members had come to stay at Cypress Manor. Thomas Harrison's story became increasingly convoluted as he struggled to provide consistent details about these supposed relatives. He mentioned cousins from various cities, changed their ages multiple times, and could not explain why Elizabeth had not mentioned their visit during our previous conversations. The situation became even more suspicious when Elizabeth Harrison returned to the study with obvious signs of distress. Her dress was disheveled, her hair had come loose from its pins, and there were what appeared to be scratch marks on her hands and forearms. When I inquired about her welfare, she claimed she had fallen while carrying linens upstairs, but her explanation was delivered with the same nervous inconsistency that had characterized her husband's stories about visiting cousins. Most troubling of all was the complete silence that had descended upon the upper floors of the mansion. The sounds of children in distress had stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive quiet that was somehow more unsettling than the previous commotion. It was as if someone had taken immediate action to silence whatever had been causing the disturbance, and the implications of that silence filled me with growing dread. I attempted to conclude our business as quickly as possible, but Thomas Harrison seemed reluctant to let me leave. He began asking unnecessary questions about the legal documents, requesting clarifications on points that had already been thoroughly explained, and generally prolonging our meeting in what seemed like a desperate attempt to prevent me from departing while the situation upstairs remained unresolved. During this forced extension of our meeting, I heard Elizabeth Harrison moving through the house with unusual haste. Her footsteps echoed in the hallways above us, and I occasionally heard the sound of doors opening and closing in rapid succession. At one point, I distinctly heard the rattle of chains, followed by Elizabeth's voice speaking in sharp, urgent whispers to someone whose responses I could not make out. The entire atmosphere of Cypress Manor had become charged with an almost palpable tension. The household staff moved through their duties with obvious anxiety, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when absolutely necessary, even the family. Dog, a normally friendly retriever named Duke, seemed nervous and withdrawn, staying close to the walls and flinching at sudden sounds. When I finally managed to excuse myself from the prolonged meeting, Thomas Harrison insisted on personally escorting me to my horse, something he had never done during any of my previous visits. As we walked through the front hallway, I noticed that several doors that had previously been open were now firmly closed and secured with new iron locks. The keys to these locks were nowhere to be seen, suggesting that access to certain areas of the house was now strictly controlled. During our walk to the front door, I caught a glimpse of Elizabeth Harrison through a partially open doorway. She was standing at the bottom of a staircase that led to the upper floors, holding what appeared to be a large ring of keys in one hand and a small bottle of some dark liquid in the other. Her expression was one of barely controlled panic, and when she noticed me looking in her direction, she quickly stepped back into the shadows. As Thomas Harrison helped me mount my horse, he made an unusual request. He asked that I postpone any future visits to Cypress Manor for several weeks, explaining that the family would be dealing with personal matters that required privacy. He suggested that any necessary county business could be handled through written correspondence or meetings at the county courthouse rather than at the plantation. This request was highly irregular, as my duties required regular on-site inspections of property records and documentation that could only be properly verified at the plantation itself. However, Thomas Harrison's insistence was so forceful, and his obvious distress so apparent, that I agreed to honor his request while privately resolving to investigate the situation through other means. The ride back to town provided an opportunity to process what I had witnessed at Cypress Manor. The evidence was circumstantial but deeply troubling. The sounds of children in distress, the Harrison family's obvious deception about visiting relatives, the new security measures throughout the house, and the general atmosphere of fear and secrecy all pointed to something seriously wrong at the plantation. My professional training had taught me to document observations carefully and avoid jumping to conclusions without sufficient evidence. However, my human instincts were screaming that children were being harmed at Cypress Manor and that the Harrison family was engaged in activities that went far beyond normal plantation operations or domestic discipline. That evening, I began making discreet inquiries among other county officials and longtime residents who might have additional information about recent developments at the Harrison plantation. I was careful to frame my questions as routine administrative matters, but I was determined to gather enough evidence to justify a more thorough investigation of the situation. The responses I received only deepened my concerns. Several people mentioned unusual nighttime activities at Cypress Manor, including the arrival of wagons under cover of darkness and the construction of additional outbuildings that seemed to serve no obvious agricultural purpose. Others reported that the Harrison family had become increasingly reclusive, declining social invitations and avoiding public gatherings where they had previously been regular participants. Most significantly, I learned that several families in the surrounding area had reported missing children over the past year. These disappearances had been attributed to various causes: runaways seeking better opportunities in distant cities, deaths from illness that had not been properly reported, or simple record-keeping errors that were common in rural communities. However, the pattern of missing children, combined with the disturbing evidence I had observed at Cypress Manor, suggested a far darker possibility. As I lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of our peaceful town settling into sleep, I realized that I could no longer ignore what I had witnessed. The safety of innocent children was at stake, and my position as a county official gave me both the authority and the moral obligation to investigate further. The time had come to uncover the truth about what was happening behind the elegant facade of Cypress Manor, regardless of the consequences to my career or standing in the community. My investigation began in earnest the following week when I approached Sheriff William Carter with my concerns about the Harrison plantation. Carter was a practical man who had served as our county's primary law enforcement officer for nearly 15 years, and his reputation for thoroughness and discretion made him the ideal person to consult about such a delicate matter. I presented my observations carefully, emphasizing the documented facts rather than my suspicions. The sounds of children in distress, the Harrison family's increasingly erratic behavior, the unexplained security measures, and the pattern of missing children in the surrounding area all warranted official attention. Sheriff Carter listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions about specific details and timelines. What surprised me was that Carter had been receiving similar reports from other sources. A traveling merchant named James Mitchell had approached him the previous month with concerns about unusual activities at Cypress Manor. Mitchell regularly conducted business with plantations throughout the county, and he had noticed significant changes in the Harrison family's purchasing patterns over the past year. According to Mitchell, the Harrisons had been buying extraordinary quantities of basic provisions, far more than would be needed for their household and enslaved population. They had also purchased medical supplies, restraints, and building materials. That seemed inconsistent with normal plantation operations. Most troubling was their acquisition of large amounts of laudanum and other sedatives, quantities that suggested medical needs far beyond what a typical plantation family would require. Sheriff Carter had also received a disturbing report from Dr. Henry Adams, our county's only trained physician. Dr. Adams had been called to treat a young girl who had been found wandering along the main road between Cypress Manor and town, severely malnourished and showing signs of prolonged confinement. The child appeared to be approximately 8 years old, but she was so traumatized that she could barely speak coherently. When Dr. Adams attempted to determine where the child had come from, she became hysterical and repeatedly begged not to be returned to the dark place with all the others. She spoke of being kept in a small space with many other children, of being given bitter medicine that made her sleep, and of adults who would come in the darkness to select children for reasons she could not understand or explain. The child had been found wearing a simple cotton dress that bore no identifying marks, and her physical condition suggested prolonged neglect and possible abuse. Dr. Adams had attempted to place her with a local family willing to provide temporary care, but she had disappeared from their home after only 3 days, leaving behind no trace of where she might have gone. Most significantly, the timing of the child's appearance coincided with my observations of increased activity and distress at Cypress Manor. Dr. Adams believed that the girl had escaped from some form of confinement and had been attempting to reach town when she was discovered. Her descriptions of the dark place with all the others were consistent with my suspicions about what might be happening in the upper floors of the Harrison mansion. Armed with this additional evidence, Sheriff Carter agreed that a formal investigation was warranted. However, he emphasized the need for extreme caution given the Harrison family's prominent position in the community and the serious nature of the allegations we were considering. Any investigation would need to be conducted carefully to avoid false accusations that could destroy innocent reputations, while ensuring that genuine crimes were not allowed to continue. Our first step was to conduct discreet surveillance of Cypress Manor to document the unusual activities that had been reported by multiple witnesses. Sheriff Carter enlisted the help of 2 deputies, Marcus Thompson and Robert Davis, both of whom were known for their reliability and discretion. We established observation points around the plantation that would allow us to monitor activities without alerting the Harrison family to our presence. The surveillance began immediately and quickly confirmed our worst fears. During the first night of observation, we witnessed the arrival of a covered wagon at Cypress Manor well after midnight. The wagon was driven by a man we did not recognize, and it approached the mansion through a rarely used back road that avoided the main plantation entrance. From our concealed position, we watched as Thomas Harrison and 2 other men unloaded what appeared to be several small motionless forms from the wagon. The forms were wrapped in blankets, but their size and shape strongly suggested they were children. The men moved quickly and efficiently, carrying their burdens directly into the mansion through a side entrance that we had not seen used during normal daylight activities. The entire operation was conducted in near silence with the participants, communicating through gestures rather than spoken words. The level of organization and secrecy suggested that this was a well-established routine rather than an isolated incident. After the wagon was unloaded, it departed immediately using the same back road, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had arrived. Even more disturbing was what we observed during subsequent nights of surveillance. The pattern of nighttime. Arrivals continued, with wagons delivering their mysterious cargo approximately every 3 or 4 days. The routine never varied. The wagons would arrive after midnight, unload their contents quickly and silently, and depart before dawn. During daylight hours, we noticed that certain windows in the upper floors of the mansion were kept covered with heavy curtains, preventing any view of the interior. However, we occasionally observed shadows moving behind these curtains, and on several occasions, we heard faint sounds that could have been children calling out in distress. Most telling was the behavior of the Harrison family during this period. Elizabeth Harrison had stopped attending church services and social gatherings entirely, claiming illness that prevented her from fulfilling her normal community obligations. Thomas Harrison continued to conduct necessary business, but his demeanor had changed dramatically. He appeared haggard and nervous, jumping at sudden sounds and showing signs of severe stress. The family's enslaved workers also displayed obvious signs of fear and anxiety. Several of them approached Sheriff Carter privately to report that they had been forbidden from entering certain areas of the mansion and that they had heard disturbing sounds coming from the upper floors. They described an atmosphere of terror that had descended upon the plantation, with severe punishments threatened for anyone who spoke about what they might have observed. One particularly brave woman named Sarah, who worked as a house servant, provided crucial information about the interior layout of the mansion. She described how several rooms in the attic had been converted into what appeared to be holding cells, with heavy locks installed on the doors and windows boarded up from the inside. She had seen Elizabeth Harrison carrying trays of food to these rooms but had been strictly forbidden from accompanying her. Sarah also reported that she had observed Elizabeth Harrison preparing large quantities of a bitter-smelling liquid that she believed was some form of sedative. The liquid was administered to whoever was being held in the attic rooms, and Sarah had noticed that the sounds of distress would diminish significantly after Elizabeth's visits with the mysterious medicine. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah confirmed that the number of people being held in the attic had been increasing steadily over the past year. She estimated that there were currently dozens of individuals confined in those rooms, based on the quantities of food being prepared and the number of chamber pots that needed to be emptied. As our investigation continued, we began to piece together a horrifying picture of what was happening at Cypress Manor. The Harrison family appeared to be operating some form of illegal confinement facility, holding what we suspected were kidnapped children in conditions that could only be described as imprisonment. The systematic nature of the operation, the regular deliveries of new victims, and the elaborate security measures all suggested a criminal enterprise of shocking scope and cruelty. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but Sheriff Carter knew that we needed to act quickly before more children could be harmed. He began making preparations for a formal raid on Cypress Manor, but the planning required extreme care. The Harrison family's prominent position meant that any accusations needed to be supported by irrefutable evidence, and the safety of the potential victims had to be our primary concern. Dr. Adams agreed to accompany us during the raid to provide immediate medical attention to any children we might find, and arrangements were made with the Methodist Church to provide temporary shelter and care for potential victims. The local magistrate was informed of our investigation and agreed to issue the necessary warrants for searching the plantation and arresting anyone found to be involved in criminal activities. As we prepared for what we knew would be a confrontation that would forever change our community, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something even worse than we had imagined. The evidence already suggested a level of systematic cruelty that challenged everything I thought I knew about human nature. But my instincts told me that the full truth about Cypress Manor would prove to be far more horrifying than any of us were prepared to discover. The raid on Cypress Manor was scheduled for dawn on a Thursday morning in late May, when we expected the Harrison family to be least prepared for official intervention. Sheriff Carter assembled a team of 6 men, including myself, Dr. Adams, deputies Thompson and Davis, and 2 additional officers borrowed from the neighboring county, to ensure we had sufficient manpower to handle whatever we might encounter. We approached the plantation in the pre-dawn darkness, using the same back roads that we had observed the mysterious wagons traveling during our surveillance. The morning air was thick with humidity and the scent of blooming magnolias, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the grim purpose of our mission. Thomas Harrison answered our forceful knocking at the front door, appearing disheveled and clearly startled by our early arrival. His face went pale when Sheriff Carter presented the search warrant, and his hands trembled visibly as he read the legal document that authorized us to inspect every inch of his property. He called for Elizabeth, who appeared moments later wearing a hastily donned robe, her hair uncombed and her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine terror. Sheriff Carter wasted no time with pleasantries, immediately informing the Harrison family that they were under investigation for serious criminal activities and that any attempt to interfere with our search would result in immediate arrest. Thomas Harrison began to protest, claiming that we had no right to invade his home based on unfounded suspicions, but his objections were weak and unconvincing. Elizabeth Harrison's reaction was far more telling. She began sobbing hysterically, begging us not to go upstairs and claiming that we did not understand the situation. When Deputy Thompson moved toward the staircase leading to the upper floors, she physically threw herself in his path, screaming that we would ruin everything they had worked to accomplish. The keys to the locked rooms were hidden in Elizabeth's bedroom, concealed inside a jewelry box beneath layers of silk scarves and personal items. When Sheriff Carter demanded that she produce them, she initially claimed ignorance, but the discovery of the key ring made further denials impossible. The keys were old and heavy, designed for serious security rather than simple privacy. Our ascent to the upper floors of the mansion revealed the true horror of what the Harrison family had been concealing. The elegant hallways that I remembered from my official visits had been transformed into something resembling a prison. Heavy wooden doors with iron reinforcements blocked access to multiple rooms, and the air was thick with the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Dr. Adams later identified as the smell of prolonged fear. The first door we unlocked revealed a scene that will haunt me until my dying day. The room, which had once served as a guest bedroom, now contained 12 children, ranging in age from approximately 6 to 14 years old. They were chained to iron rings that had been bolted into the floor, with just enough length of chain to allow them to lie down but not to stand upright or move freely around the room. The children were in various states of malnutrition and illness, their clothing reduced to filthy rags that provided little protection or dignity. Many showed signs of physical abuse, with bruises, cuts, and scars covering their thin bodies. Most heartbreaking of all was their reaction to our presence. Instead of joy or relief at being discovered, they cowered in terror, clearly expecting more punishment and abuse. Dr. Adams immediately began examining the children, while Sheriff Carter and his deputies continued unlocking doors throughout the upper floor. Each room revealed more victims, and the scope of the Harrison family's criminal operation became increasingly clear. By the time we had unlocked all of the secured rooms, we had discovered 38 children in total, all held in conditions of unimaginable cruelty and neglect. The children ranged in age from very young, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, to adolescents who appeared to be in their mid-teens. They represented multiple races and ethnicities, suggesting that the Harrison family had been systematically kidnapping victims from various communities throughout Alabama and possibly neighboring states. Some of the children bore physical characteristics that suggested they had been held captive for extended periods, possibly years. Dr. Adams worked tirelessly to provide immediate medical attention to the most severely injured and ill children, while Deputies Thompson and Davis began the process of carefully documenting the crime scene. The evidence of systematic abuse was overwhelming. The rooms contained restraints, medical instruments that appeared to have been used for torture, and detailed records that documented each child's capture date, physical condition, and behavioral characteristics. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Elizabeth Harrison's personal journal, which contained detailed entries describing the children as experimental subjects rather than human beings. The journal revealed that the Harrison family had been conducting what they termed medical research, subjecting the children to various procedures and treatments to test their theories about human endurance and psychological conditioning. Journal entries were written in Elizabeth's neat handwriting and described the children suffering with clinical detachment. She documented their responses to different forms of physical and psychological torture, recorded their attempts to escape or resist, and noted which methods were most effective in breaking their spirits and ensuring compliance with their captors' demands. Thomas Harrison's involvement became clear when we discovered his detailed financial records hidden in a secret compartment of his desk. The documents revealed that he had been selling some of the children to buyers in distant cities, using his reputation as a respectable plantation owner to facilitate transactions that would have been impossible for someone of lesser social standing. The buyers were apparently wealthy individuals who shared the Harrison family's twisted interests in human experimentation and abuse. The prices paid for individual children varied based on age, physical condition, and other factors that reduced human beings to mere commodities in a market that operated in the shadows of respectable society. Even more shocking was the discovery that the Harrison family had not been working alone. The records revealed a network of accomplices throughout the region, including other plantation owners, traveling merchants, and even some local officials, who had been bribed to ignore suspicious activities or provide false documentation for the children's disappearances. As we continued our investigation of the mansion, we found evidence of elaborate planning and organization that suggested that criminal operation had been developing for several years. The conversion of the upper floors into a prison facility had required significant construction and modification, all of which had been carried out in secret by workers who had been sworn to silence or eliminated to prevent exposure. The most horrifying discovery came when we found Elizabeth Harrison's experimental laboratory in what had once been the mansion's library. The room contained medical equipment, bottles of various chemicals and drugs, and detailed charts tracking the effects of different substances and procedures on the imprisoned children. The level of systematic cruelty documented in these records exceeded anything that any of us had imagined possible. Sheriff Carter placed both Thomas and Elizabeth Harrison under arrest, charging them with kidnapping, assault, false imprisonment, and numerous other crimes that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences or possibly even execution. Their protests of innocence were feeble and unconvincing in the face of the overwhelming evidence we had discovered. The process of safely removing the 38 children from Cypress Manor required careful coordination with Dr. Adams and volunteer caregivers from the local churches. Many of the children were too weak to walk unassisted, and all of them were severely traumatized by their experiences. The task of helping them recover would require months or possibly years of patient care and support. As news of our discoveries spread throughout Millbrook County, the community reacted with shock, horror, and disbelief that such systematic cruelty had been occurring in their midst. The Harrison family's reputation as pillars of the community made the revelations even more devastating, forcing everyone to question how such evil could have remained hidden for so long. The investigation continued for weeks as we worked to identify all of the children and locate their families, many of whom had given up hope of ever seeing their missing loved ones again. The network of accomplices gradually came to light, leading to additional arrests and revelations that shook the foundations of our rural Alabama community. The full scope of the Harrison family's crimes would take months to uncover completely, but it was already clear that we had stumbled upon one of the most horrific cases of systematic child abuse and trafficking in the history of our state. The elegant facade of Cypress Manor had concealed a nightmare that challenged everything we thought we knew about human nature and the capacity for evil that could exist beneath the surface of respectable society. The weeks following the raid on Cypress Manor transformed Millbrook County in ways that none of us could have anticipated. The 38 children we had rescued required extensive medical care and psychological support that stretched our small community's resources to their absolute limits. Dr. Adams worked tirelessly alongside volunteer nurses from neighboring counties to address the immediate physical needs of the victims, while local churches and families opened their homes to provide temporary shelter and care. Identifying the children proved to be a heartbreaking and complex process. Many of them had been held captive for so long that they could barely remember their original names or where they had come from. Others were too traumatized to speak coherently about their experiences. We relied on missing person reports from throughout Alabama and neighboring states, but the systematic nature of the Harrison family's crimes meant that many of the children had been taken from communities hundreds of miles away. The reunification process brought both joy and additional trauma as families who had mourned their children as dead suddenly found themselves confronted with the reality of what their loved ones had endured. Some children were reunited with parents who had never stopped searching for them, while others discovered that their families had moved away or even died during their years of captivity. The emotional toll on everyone involved was immense. Thomas and Elizabeth Harrison were tried in the county courthouse, where the evidence against them was so overwhelming that their defense attorneys struggled to mount any meaningful challenge to the charges. The testimony of the rescued children, though painful to hear, provided crucial details about the systematic abuse they had endured. The financial records documenting the sale of children to other abusers sealed the prosecution's case. Elizabeth Harrison's journal became a key piece of evidence, but reading her clinical descriptions of human suffering in open court proved almost unbearable for those present. Her detailed documentation of experiments conducted on helpless children revealed a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even the most experienced legal professionals. The judge was forced to clear the courtroom several times when spectators became too emotional to maintain order. The trial revealed the full extent of the criminal network that had enabled the Harrison family's operation. 7 other individuals were arrested and charged with various crimes related to the kidnapping and trafficking ring. These included plantation owners from neighboring counties, traveling merchants who had served as intermediaries, and even a local magistrate who had accepted bribes to falsify official records. The investigation expanded beyond Alabama as federal authorities became involved in tracking down buyers who had purchased children from the Harrison network. Raids conducted in Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee uncovered additional victims and led to more arrests. The scope of the criminal enterprise far exceeded anything that local law enforcement had initially imagined possible. The fate of Thomas and Elizabeth Harrison was decided after a trial that lasted 3 weeks and drew spectators from across the state. Both were convicted on multiple charges including kidnapping, assault, conspiracy, and human trafficking. Thomas Harrison was sentenced to death by hanging, while Elizabeth Harrison received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Their appeals were denied, and Thomas Harrison's execution was carried out 6 months later in the county jail yard. The Cypress Manor plantation was seized by the state and sold at auction, with the proceeds used to establish a fund for the care and rehabilitation of the rescued children. The mansion itself was eventually demolished after local residents claimed it was haunted by the spirits of the children who had suffered within its walls. Today, the site is marked only by a simple stone memorial listing the names of the 38 victims who were rescued. The impact on our community extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the arrests and trials. Millbrook County struggled to come to terms with the realization that such horrific crimes had been occurring in their midst while the perpetrators maintained positions of respect and social prominence. The case forced a fundamental reevaluation of how well we truly knew our neighbors and what kinds of secrets might be hidden behind facades of respectability. Several families left the county entirely, unable to bear living in a place where such systematic cruelty had flourished unchecked for years. Others threw themselves into efforts to help the rescued children recover and rebuild their lives. The Methodist Church established a special fund for ongoing medical and psychological care, while local schools created programs to help the children who were healthy enough to resume their education. My own role in uncovering the crimes forever changed my relationship with the community I had served as county clerk. While many praised my persistence in investigating suspicious activities, others questioned why I had not acted sooner or more decisively. The weight of knowing that children had continued to suffer while I gathered evidence haunted me for years, even though I understood that premature action might have resulted in the destruction of evidence and the escape of the perpetrators. The rescued children faced varying degrees of success in their recovery and reintegration into normal life. Some of the younger victims, with intensive care and support, were eventually able to overcome their trauma and build healthy relationships with their adoptive families. Others, particularly those who had endured years of captivity and abuse, struggled with lasting psychological damage that affected them throughout their lives. Several of the older children who had retained clear memories of their experiences before captivity chose to testify in subsequent trials as federal authorities pursued other members of the trafficking network. Their courage in confronting their abusers helped secure additional convictions and provided closure for some of the families affected by these crimes. The case had lasting effects on law enforcement practices throughout Alabama and neighboring states. Sheriff Carter worked with state officials to establish better communication systems for tracking missing children and coordinating investigations across county lines. New protocols were developed for recognizing signs of human trafficking and for responding more quickly to reports of suspicious activities. Dr. Adams documented the medical aspects of the case in professional journals, helping to educate other physicians about the physical and psychological signs of systematic abuse. His work contributed to improved training for medical professionals in recognizing and treating victims of trafficking and organized abuse. The story of the Harrison family crimes became a cautionary tale that spread far beyond our rural Alabama county. Newspapers throughout the South covered the trials extensively, and the case was cited in legislative debates about strengthening laws against human trafficking and child abuse. The systematic nature of the crimes and the social prominence of the perpetrators challenged common assumptions about who might be capable of such cruelty. Years later, as I reflected on the events that had forever changed our community, I came to understand that the Harrison family case represented something darker than simple criminal behavior. It revealed the capacity for organized evil to flourish in plain sight, protected by social respectability and enabled by the reluctance of decent people to believe that such horrors could exist in their midst. The 38 children who were rescued from Cypress Manor became symbols of both human resilience and the importance of remaining vigilant against injustice. Their survival and eventual recovery proved that even the most systematic cruelty cannot entirely destroy the human spirit, while their suffering reminded us that evil often hides behind masks of respectability and social prominence. Today, more than 8 decades after these events, I remain haunted by the knowledge that similar crimes may be occurring in communities throughout our nation, hidden behind facades of normalcy and protected by the unwillingness of good people to believe in the existence of such systematic evil. The lesson of Cypress Manor is that we must remain alert to signs of abuse and exploitation, even when they occur in places and involve people we would never suspect. The legacy of those 38 children lives on in the improved laws, better investigative techniques, and increased awareness that their suffering helped to create. Their story serves as a permanent reminder that the price of freedom and safety is eternal vigilance, and that we must never allow social respectability or personal discomfort to prevent us from protecting the most vulnerable members of our society. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.